Good afternoon. So I'm going to say that Detroit was the poster child for austerity politics, and I'm going to go through what happened in Detroit and some of the policies that were put in place by our friend Betsy DeVos to destroy public education in the city of Detroit. So I am a proud graduate of Cass Technical High School in Detroit, Michigan. When I was in high school, Detroit was the center of education. We were a model school district. People came from all over the world to look at some of our classrooms and to see what we were doing in the city of Detroit. Today, we find ourselves fighting through a period of crisis, which is the result of long-term intentional campaign to destroy public education. In Detroit, like many urban school districts around the country, the assault on public education came in the form of a state takeover. As Gary mentioned, these emergency managers. When the state took over education in the city of Detroit, we had a budget surplus. Part of the takeover was a result of a bond issue that passed, which was going to bring in billions of dollars into our public school system. And so I guess our friends in Lansing decided that the people in Detroit didn't know what to do with that money. So after years of mismanagement by a series of appointed emergency managers, we found ourselves in 2015 with a debt that was over $515 million. So in 1999, we had Governor Engler, and actually this started with Governor Engler in 1999. He appointed a school board, so for years we were without an elected, empowered school board. In 2009, Governor Granholm, who we thought was our friend, appointed Robert Bobb as one of the first emergency managers. In 2015, things came to a head in Detroit with Darnell Early, who I guess everyone knows now is also associated with the Flint water crisis. So also our credit rating fell, which was a big issue for us because then normally the school district would borrow money. We couldn't even borrow money to fill our debt. So as the debt that our schools were facing grew, also the physical conditions in our school buildings around the city declined. So what the emergency managers were doing, things were breaking, and they just put a Band-Aid on it. They weren't really fixing our facilities, and so there was years and years of mismanagement. There was years and years of our buildings and facilities not being taken care of. So I guess as many of you know, there was a big campaign, so the teachers got fed up and they created these rolling sick-outs. And all the sick-outs came to a head because of the deplorable conditions, the overcrowded classrooms and buildings, holes in ceilings. We had rat infestations. We had mold in many of our buildings. And one of our schools, which is Spain Elementary School, and I do have the picture of Spain Elementary School, the whole gym floor was just filled with black mold. So these are just some of our classrooms that had the large class sizes. One of them was 38, one was 42. Then we had the building disrepair. So this is just some of the pictures of what was going on in some of our classrooms. And what many describe as gross mismanagement up under the emergency managers, we describe as criminal. So Republican lawmakers in Michigan, specifically our Michigan House of Representatives, backed by Betsy DeVos, yeah, and you can thank Michigan for Betsy. I'm sorry about that. They were trying to put the nail in the coffin to just totally destroy Detroit Public Schools. So what happened was they failed to pay the state's debt. They threatened our job security and our union rights. They want to privatize educational services. And then they continue to take away our local voice and control over our school districts. The legislation would have applied only to Detroit schools, which was the craziest thing on the earth. And they still have some legislation today that only applies to Detroit public schools. In Detroit, Detroit is the only public school system in Michigan where you can hire uncertified teachers. So still, the austerity politics are still rampant in Detroit. So what we did was, with member and community mobilization action, we were able to defeat some of the bills that were on the table in the House. We were able to work with our neighborhood and community leaders to get back some of our public schools. Part of our story is that the governor created a school system within a school system. It was called the EAA, and we call it a failed experiment. EAA, there were 11 schools that used to be Detroit public schools. And those schools were put into a little group, and they basically were a charter school within our public school system. I can say that this year those schools will return back to Detroit public schools, because when they looked at student achievement, it was in the toilet. So what we learned from what happened in Detroit, and I just want to emphasize that we still continue to struggle. So what we learned is that there's a formula for destruction. Part of that is to just starve the schools out. So you starve the schools out. You don't give them the resources that are needed. You don't pay people a decent salary and a wage. You don't take care of the buildings. Whenever something's broken, you just don't fix it. And then you declare it a failure, even though it's to no fault of the people who are working in the system. And what happens after that? Then you decide, well, since they can't do it and it's a failure and everything, we're just going to privatize and give it to those who can make a profit off of it. So some of the work that we were able to do in fighting back some of these politics and things that were happening in Detroit were, so as I said before, we did work with city leaders, community members, parents, to bring things back together. So we held rallies in Lansing to fight against some of the bad legislation, and I can say that we won some things. Some things I feel that we lost, because the $515 million debt payment, when we received money to pay the state, from the state to pay that debt off, we did not receive the proper funding. And so that causes us today to still struggle. We were able to get rid of Darnell early, which was totally a victory, and I think he kind of ran out with his tail between his legs. We were really happy for that. It was a long time coming. We were able to pick one of our own and have her chosen to be our interim superintendent, Alicia Merriweather. She did a wonderful job. The teachers had a lot of voice in her becoming our interim superintendent. We also were able to become a part of a literacy lawsuit that is still ongoing. The lawyer is from California. He read about what was happening in Detroit when it came to literacy, and he came in and filed the lawsuit, and then we signed on with him. We were able to also file a lawsuit regarding the building conditions. We were able to get the judge to make it an order instead of just I can't remember, but just instead of just like we went to Merck and just kind of went through. But anyway, it's an order, and it's standing now. The district has to create a campaign to address all the building conditions. We've had many changes between Darnell Early leaving and Alicia Merriweather being our interim person, where we have not actually created the campaign, but I am proud to say that we do have a new superintendent who is actually a superintendent, and he and I are going to work on creating a campaign to address all the issues that we have with our buildings. There's a book called Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. There's a sociologist and Princeton professor, Matt Desmond. He wrote about the intentional efforts to undermine public housing. He says eventually, after America's public housing experiment was defunded and declared a failure, in that order, they, the privatizers, would have their day. And we can compare that to what happened in Detroit with what they were trying to do with public education. Also, in Detroit, Detroit has a history of redlining, which started back, I want to say, in the 30s on our west side of our city. And our mayor, Mayor Duggan, did a presentation at Mackinac this summer on redlining and how that has affected Detroit throughout all these years. I think it's worth noting that affordable housing and quality public education are tied in ways that are too numerous to talk about today during this conversation, but I think that is definitely something worth looking into, because after I start looking into it more with the city of Detroit, the two are tied. But we know with absolute certainty that these attacks, as Randy has said again and again, are part of a decades-long campaign to rig the economy against working people, and in particular against Black and brown communities. With the help from National AFT, our union worked to mobilize our members and communities around the efforts to get better funding for our schools, because funding, as Gary mentioned earlier, is definitely an issue in Michigan. Detroit has 13% of our population is students with special needs, and it costs our per pupil funding, I believe, is like $7,500, but it costs double that to educate a student with special needs. This rally was a rally where the teachers were told that they would not receive pay for work that they had already done, and we were successful in getting a guarantee from the district that the teachers would be able to get paid for time that they had already worked. We now have a newly elected school board, and this is a picture of Spain Elementary School. There was an earlier picture that you saw of their gym with the floor fully molded, and this is what we have now with thanks to Ellen DeGeneres, and I believe it was Justin Bieber, and they created a GoFundMe page. And so this is what the school looks like now, and the students are able to use the gym. So during the last 2 years, we have successfully fought to have emergency managers removed from our school district, and we have a locally elected school board. We've entered into a partnership with the American Federation of Teachers to work and fight back some of this bad legislation that is happening in Michigan. We've led member engagement efforts using one-on-one efforts to also increase our membership, because as you know, Michigan is a right-to-work state. So we're being attacked from all angles. They're just trying to totally not only destroy public education, but also destroy unions. So I just want to end with that, saying that austerity is alive and well in the city of Detroit, but we continue to fight back against it. I do know that today, there is a case that's going to be heard in the Supreme Court about 3% health care. So the teachers were forced to pay 3% of their checks, 3% out of their checks for health care, and it was never voted on. We never knew anything about it. You know, it just kind of, somebody decided one day, hey, we're going to take part of their money. And so hopefully we're victorious today in that effort to get all those teachers their money back that was taken from them over a 1.5-year period. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivy, for making the link between what's going on the ground and scholarship. As you said, a few academics, and that's why we've sandwiched you here with 2 scholars. But also thank you for suggesting to Leo that we have 2 other possibilities, Justin Lieber and Ellen DeGeneres, for the next panel we do here. But let's hear from Mike about his work.